name is David Anderman. I'm Chapters Coordinator for the California Space Development Council, which is a coalition of chapters in California of the National Space Society. This event is being hosted by the Inland Empire Space Group, which is a chapter of the National Space Society. I'd like to thank David Bliss, the president of the chapter, for hosting this event and doing the work necessary to get the candidates rounded up and for securing this location. There are two themes for this forum this morning. One is the future of the California aerospace industry. In the last 2 years, there's been a considerable decline in employment, the number of companies employing folks to work in the aerospace industry in Southern California, and a considerable amount of concern on the future of the industry, whether this is a short-term dip or perhaps portends long-term problems for the aerospace industry in California. The second issue, the second theme of the conference of the meeting will be the future of the nation's space program. At this point, there's a presidential election coming up. There are two candidates who have extremely different views on the future of the space program, as indicated in their platforms. We'd like to find out from the candidates how they view the future of the program, such themes as some of the new launch technologies, the shuttle program, the space station program. Now, we're going to allow each candidate or representative 5 to 10 minutes to speak on their views on these two issues, after which we'll open up the forum for questions. We've done a lottery. We've given Figaroa, representing Congressman George Brown. He's the field director. George Brown, is probably everyone here knows, is the Senate or his House Committee Chairman on Space and Science and Technology, longtime supporter of the space program. It'll be very interesting to hear from Mr. Figaroa on how George Brown views these two issues. So without any further ado, Senator Figaroa.
Good morning. I want to thank the organization for inviting us here. I'd just like to first say that Mr. Brown wants to thank all of the past volunteers who have worked on his campaign and would appreciate your support once again. Mr. Brown is facing his toughest challenge yet to date. His opponent, as many of you know, is a gentleman who built the Voyager airplane that flew around the world on a tank of gas. He's running a very aggressive campaign, and we're looking for any of you who are willing to donate a Saturday or a Sunday to get out and walk precincts for Mr. Brown. We'd appreciate that. It's one of the things we have going on right now is we're out putting yard signs up, we're out walking the Rancho Cucamonga area. So if any of you have any time today, we'd appreciate you coming to work for Mr. Brown. I was given a list of questions that were to be addressed today. And if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is go over some of those points. And one of the main points we wanted to talk about this morning is the goals of the space program. And as an original sponsor of the Space Settlement Act of 1988, Mr. Brown supports the goals of establishing a permanent human presence in space. Mr. Brown attached language to the report accompanying Public Law 100-685, directing NASA to periodically report to Congress on progress made towards that goal. Unfortunately, stringent fiscal constraints mean that the establishment of permanent space settlements must remain a long-term goal. Mr. Brown does not believe anyone can say exactly when the American public will be willing to fund such an effort. Nonetheless, he believes we need to move in that direction, and we are. For example, space station freedom, despite some limitations, represents an important stepping stone toward permanent human presence in space. Mr. Brown helped lead the fight to keep it funded and on course. Mr. Brown believes very strongly in a balanced space program of scientific discovery, exploration, and practical and commercial applications. Although he is not willing to identify exploration as the single primary goal of the space program, he thinks that exploration in its broadest sense, human and robotic, should remain a cornerstone of America's space program. If you'd like, what I want to do is hand out some information about Mr. Brown and some of the points that we're going to be addressing this morning. Like I mentioned before, we have a lot of things going on right now. And as field director, my main goal is to recruit you people, if you can, to help us get Mr. Brown reelected. He has many things pending right now in Washington. And what we'd like to do is inform you about that and tell you that he will be in Colton at his campaign headquarters next weekend on Saturday. And everyone is invited to attend. We're having this big rally and a walk. And any questions you have, it would be best to ask him personally, and he'll be right there, and he's willing to talk about anything you want to talk about concerning space, and the decline of the aerospace industry and diversion of these companies, And what I'd like to do right now is hand out some information about Mr. Brown, and I hope if you have any other questions that you can ask him directly, and that will be next week. All right? I want to thank you once again for giving me the opportunity to give at least some brief points on that, and I'd like to hand out this information. Thank you.
Okay, we'll now hear from a Libertarian candidate for the 42nd District, Mr. Fritz, Warden. He's a PhD student today in political theory, and he's specializing in 18th century political theory. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Mr. Warden.
I'll wait just a minute while I'll pass this out, Mr. Brown's literature, and then I'll go ahead and start.
Sir.
No problem. Okay. I'd like to begin by pointing out that I ran for office because I had written George Brown a number of letters, and they all ended with the same comment: I think this matter deserves more debate. However, none of the issues that I mentioned in my various letters, including the legalization of hemp and so forth, involved space policy, but I'll take this opportunity to debate Brown anyway. I'd like to point out, by the way, that if you all want to volunteer on my campaign, I'm walking in Bloomington. And so bring a gun, and we'll be very happy together. I think I'll begin by telling you a little bit about what libertarian thought is about, and then I'm going to address each of the issues that were given in the questionnaire. And then I will make some brief conclusion about where libertarians see not only space policy going, but this country's fiscal policy as well. Libertarians believe that government exists primarily, in the words of John Locke, to defend life, liberty, and property. As such, we believe that individuals should be free to organize their lives and pursue their own interests, either alone or in tandem with others, without any governmental interference. Government may legitimately intervene in human affairs only when the actions of one individual or group directly harm other individuals, persons, or property. Libertarians then favor a policy of laissez-faire in both economic and personal matters, and believe that government intervention in such areas is not only a violation of rights, but also counterproductive. With regard to space policy, libertarians favor private initiative and investment as a general rule. While one can argue that space explorations have, in the past, brought back a wide variety of economic benefits despite government funding, libertarians nonetheless assert that private investment also brings healthy economic returns, usually much more efficiently than government. Moreover, government investments, at least for the foreseeable future, will be paid for twice. Once by using the investment money that might have been used elsewhere, for example in education, infrastructure, and new capital investments in industry, etc. And again, in future taxes that will not only have to pay off the debt, but the interest that is accrued on it as well. To be specific and rather blunt, as an elected member of Congress, I will do my best to cut off all funding to NASA that is unrelated to national defense, and I will seriously scrutinize projects that are supposedly related to defense. I would also advocate selling off as many resources of NASA as possible to help pay off the debt. Organizations like yourselves would then be able to conduct their own research and projects with an absolute minimum of government interference and regulation and taxation, with equipment purchased at bargain basement prices. This vision of completely privatizing the space program informs all of my responses to your queries. The queries were as follows: goals of the space program. I believe the goals of the space program should be whatever you folks or whoever invests is willing to fund. Space exploration initiative. I oppose all government funds in this or any other space policy. Commercialization of space. I favor it. You're going to have to find some way to fund this. Launch Services Purchase Act. I would implement the act by abolishing NASA. Use of Russian space technology. Again, this should be the decision of private investors and promoters of space research and exploration. And as for the Delta Clipper, I feel no further funding should come from the public sector. The suborbital model should be sold to any investors willing to put further resources into it. In conclusion, I would like to add that the government has grown so large that we face the real possibility that we are going to be bankrupt in 1995. What that means in really blunt terms is that by 1995, it is a very good chance that we will not be able to pay the interest on the debt. For those of you that are not aware of it, all the states west of Missouri, this year, all the tax dollars in all those states that went to the federal government went solely to funding the interest on the national debt. It is fiscally irresponsible to continue to operate the government the way we are. The only way we're going to see any very real change is if government ceases and desists in its policy, which is generally to take money from one sector of the economy and give it to another. I would argue that is not only morally wrong, it is terribly inefficient and wasteful, and it's going to lead to a disaster. And that disaster can only be removed either by dramatically raising taxes, which I would oppose because it would cause a great amount of hardship, or by cutting back the services that government has. I would suggest that it is high time we limit government to its proper function of protecting individual rights and ending subsidies to all groups, including space groups and others, who believe that they personally represent the interests of everyone living in this country. Those groups that want to pursue their own activities should use their own resources and their own time. Those who believe they can make a return on it, more power to them. I'm not going to restrict them with regulation and taxes. But I'm not going to sit around and watch thousands, millions of dollars be stolen from American citizens in the form of taxation to pay for policies that may, at best, have dubious benefits. Thank you.
Our next speaker is going to be Robert Wolf. He's a member of, representing Ken Calvert in the 43rd District. Ken Calvert is running as a Republican. Bob Wolf is a member of Ken Calvert's steering committee. He's also the chair of the Riverside County Planning Commission and the Lincoln Club. So I'd like to welcome Bob Wolf.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much. I'm going to abandon responses that I have from the candidate, Mr. Calvert, to specific questions that were forwarded to us, and I suspect that if I understand the new format, I'd be happy to answer them in the voice of the candidate if they come from the audience. But I'd like to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank you on behalf of Ken Calvert, candidate for the 43rd Congressional District, and the entire campaign for issuing this invitation to an organization that so much encapsulates Mr. Calvert's perception of what we should be doing, where we should be going, what the future of the state, and by extension the United States, really lies. I want to introduce Sue Miller from our campaign, the real brains of the operation, the hardest working person we have. And if in fact you like what you hear about Ken Calvert, yes, you deserve it. If you like what you hear about Ken Calvert, we'd ask that maybe you touch bases with her, and perhaps there's something that we can do together to ensure the future not only of the 43rd Congressional District, but the state of California. Hopefully we can somehow influence the United States of America. Let me take a moment to just give you some overarching principles, ideals, and dictates that drive Ken Calvert as an individual. In order to do so, and since I have a few minutes, let me digress. That one of the most important legacies left to us as a people by the first president of the United States, Mr. Washington, was the peaceful transition of power from one administration to another. That is one of the most beautiful things and something that's unequaled throughout the entire world. And one reason that that's effective, the next time you watch a presidential inauguration, I ask you to look at this, that standing next to the president, whether he's outgoing or whether he's remaining, will be a gentleman. It is a gentleman, this is a sexist, a very nondescript individual will have at his side a suitcase. And as that entire inauguration procedure goes forward, and when the oath of office has been administered, if it is a new president, watch that individual closely, because he will very discreetly step over and stand next to the new president. Inside that suitcase, ladies and gentlemen, are the launch codes for the missiles of the United States. That particular suitcase, the euphemism, is the football. Not only America has that football, but the Russians have an equal suitcase. And although they're somewhat a bit more turbulent in their transition of power, somewhat the same type of thing takes place. Well, I want to share with you that when the coup took place in Russia and Mr. Gorbachev was held captive, those who held him captive had football. They had the launch codes for the interballistic missiles aimed at this United States. And they could have, and in my opinion, would have, launched a preemptive strike if, except for one particular reason, that they knew America is the strongest nation on the face of the earth. And that precluded them from doing what could have been an act that would have ended the world as we know it. The reason, and I want to reiterate, is because we're the strongest nation on the face of the earth. And Ken Calvert believes that we must remain so in order to secure the needs of the entire world. And that means technology. That is extremely important, Mr. Calvert. And that is something he wanted me to share with you. Second of all, Mr. Calvert understands better than most people that the United States only has one of three things to sell on an international market. We either have natural resources, and I submit to you that we're well outclassed throughout the entire world. There are others who can sell more and for less money. We either have a manufacturing capability that is far more efficient or costs a lot less. We don't have it. Or we have a substantial increase in knowledge over our competitors so that we can sell knowledge and technology on an open market and compete with the rest of the world. Those are the only three things the United States can compete in. Ken Calvert is absolutely committed to making the United States the leader in technology and in brain trust. So when we look at what's going on today in national defense and in the space program, as people cut back and more people want to spend what they consider to be a peace dividend, I'd like to come back to that in just a second. Mr. Calvert is very concerned that what are we going to do with this brain trust has been entrusted to the people. The people of this country have invested in training the greatest minds in the world. And are we suddenly going to turn them out on the streets and say, sit out there, sell shoes, do something else for a little while, and when we need you again, God forbid, we're going to ask you to come back and have you right up to speed, spool up, as they say in the trade, in a manner of days. It's ridiculous, it's preposterous, and it's one of the things that I just can't believe some other candidates in political office in this area have propounded. There is no peace dividend. There is a peace deficit. We have paid a substantial price for peace in the world today, and now we have to capitalize on where we've been. We are not going to end the deficit immediately, irrespective of my friends here from the Libertarian Party. What we have to do, though, is change the direction of where that money is being spent. We can't hawk our children's future if what we're doing it for is to preserve their future. So Mr. Calvert believes that a greater increase in expenditures to educating the people of this country, to ensuring their viability in the area of space and technology is one of the most critical things the Congress of this United States can accomplish. Mr. Calvert is a true believer in what Mr. Thoreau from MIT has to say, is that if we don't do that, we will lose whatever capability we have to compete on the open market that we have today. Now I want to share from you from a personal perspective, as though Mr. Brown is the chairman of Science, Space, and Technology. But I have sat many times in 2312 and 2318 in the Rayburn building with Mr. Calvert. Mr. Calvert has a long-term demonstrated commitment to advancing the goals of science, space, and technology, specifically for California, and even more specifically for Riverside County. And I would challenge any of his opponents to even compete the slightest with his record of working towards preserving Space Systems Division in the Los Angeles Air Force Base area for Southern California, and his untiring efforts for BEMO out at Norton Air Force Base, and has worked tirelessly to support the Air Force and their launch capabilities within California as the government slowly ratchets down. I spent 10 days in Washington, D.C., just got back last week. Much of Mr. Calvert's message went with me, and we were very successful in obtaining financing for housing at March Air Force Base. This was private people going up there and doing what government take care of underground storage tanks. These are funds that have to be expended to maintain the integrity of the space complex and its manufacturing capabilities here in Southern California. And Mr. Calvert is committed to that. He has a long-standing, demonstrated willingness to serve, and he has done so up to now with his own time, his own energy, and his own financial resources. And he's asking you, those of you that have community, to help him go to Congress and further those goals from within the system instead of beating on the door from without. Appreciate you allowing us to come on his behalf today. And as we take questions, I'll try to answer them in the voice of the candidate, give you copious notes. This is something that he understands in greater depth than I do. And I'll try to share with you his insights. And again, on behalf of Ken Calvert's campaign, we appreciate this opportunity. Thank you very much.
All right, our next speaker is Mark Tekano. He's a Democratic candidate for the 43rd District. He has a degree in government policies from Harvard University. He's presently a school teacher in high school here in the Riverside area. Mr. Tekano?
I forgot to mention also I'm the president of the Community College Board of Trustees here at RCC. I couldn't ask for a better time to come up and speak at the podium. I'm a little bit, befuddled by what Mr. Calvert, as represented by Mr. Wolf, really believes about the space program. It seems to me that he's taken a sharp delineation from the libertarian stance, which is no government subsidies. And quite frankly, I think he's adopting many of the beliefs, or adopting, but agrees with many of the concepts I agree with regard to the space program. You know, you mentioned the fellow Lester Thoreau, a person that I've also been reading, and Lester Thoreau, I think, has many, sound concepts about how we want to proceed in the our future economy. Let me just say that I do support the concept of human habitation in space, and I agree with Mr. Brown that it's going to be a long-term goal. That in the intermediate stages, we're going to look at small clusters of scientists and perhaps industrialists, ultimately to forge the political and economic arguments, the will for us to be in space and inhabit it. We're going to have to find the very solid, economic rationale for putting people into space, that we can produce things that we can't produce on Earth, for example, and that there's some very, very strong interests among us as a human race to do scientific research up there, things that will benefit us as a whole entire human race. And I think there's already been some compelling spin-offs from the space program, which has been supported by our government. One of the things I want to talk about is, for instance, the fuel cell research that came out of the 1970s. Fuel cells, as you know, actually, I think on the space shuttles and certain other space missions actually provide energy. And what they are is a giant electrochemical battery that can be used to transform natural gas or substances rich in hydrogen into electricity, heat, some water, and a small amount of carbon dioxide in the case of natural gas. But this technology, if we invest in it now, if government helps out in terms of direct R&D as well as private market incentives to develop this kind of technology, which came out of the space program, we could provide the basis of a whole new economy here in Southern California. And here's the question: what are we going to do with this brain trust that Mr. Wolf alluded to? The research engineers, the scientists, people who've been working so diligently on our defense-driven aerospace and defense sector here in Southern California, which has been, I think, the great engine of our jobs here. I think we need to find a new role for them. And rather than cling to this notion that there's still this great bear out there, the Russian bear, we need to face the challenge of restructuring. And I realize that there are real challenges, that there are still some real dangers, that there's an unstable situation within Europe. But for us to peg our policy, our economic and space policy, our technical policy, how we're going to do, where we're going to take this government, to peg it to, I think, that old thinking is wrong. For the first time, we have an opportunity not to compete with other nations, compete on the basis of who's going to produce the most deadly and lethal weapons, the most effective killing articles of humankind, but who can make the best stuff for human use? Who can make for a better society? Who can make for a better standard of living, quality of life for all people on this planet? Economic competition is the cornerstone of that. But we've got to realize that, contrary to what my libertarian friends believe, I do believe that many Republicans believe this line, that free markets don't operate apart from necessarily government participation. That if you look at the space program in France or the space program the Japanese are beginning to propose, that there's a strong element of government support in these areas. And that we can't be ideological or doctrinaire about how we're going to compete. If we in this country don't get rid of small shibboleths, the democratic shibboleth of redistribute the wealth, especially when there's none been created, and I challenged my democratic heritage on that question. But you know, the other part of a heritage, which is strong, unfettered, free market principles. I don't think Republicans or Democrats really have too far disagreed on this. That there is a role for government to play in this area. Now look, defense is nothing but government-created demand, impelled by an exogenous factor. An exogenous factor being very real threats in this world. The very real threats in this world, such as the threat from the Soviet Union, threat from other kinds of, perhaps the Chinese, really cause our government to say, look, we need bombs, we need planes, we need all sorts of things to defend ourselves with. And the government in turn says, we need X billion dollars worth of these sorts of products. You, people out in the private marketplace, have at us, come get a piece of the action. Very simply, that is government-created demand. There's no reason why the government can't use other very, very strong rationale to create demand. And all I suggest is we begin to develop a politic in this country that uses those other such bases. We wake up here in Inland Empire to some of the worst air pollution in the country and in the world. I want to get back to this fuel cell technology and the potential of Southern California beginning to develop an infrastructure for an electric car industry. Economies, at their very basis, I think operate on tangible, real products that we can buy and sell. We can do things to improve our infrastructure, we can spend in that area, to invest in the long-term wealth of our community by investing in infrastructure. But really, we have to find out what are we going to put our brain trust to work on, the form of machinists who built the aerospace products, defense products. What are we going to put them to work on? We need a whole new kind of economic activity, the basis of an industry, the basis of a whole new economy. And I think electric cars are, a very, very promising avenue. Why? Think of the kinds of engineering and research problems that we're going to have to solve. And I don't believe, now if you don't think the private market, if you don't think the government makes a difference in our economy here in Southern California, look at what the reduction of these contracts have done to us. That's the empirical proof. You don't have to, aside from the very nice theoretical constructs that ought to work, what happens in the real world? Fact is, bottom line, we reduced government spending in the area of defense and aerospace. That's bottom line. Now, I think that's already, strong evidence that the government really makes a difference. Government spending really makes a difference in an area. What are we going to do to replace that? I've already begun to sort of allude to that area. I can get more specific on what my vision is for an electric car industry here in Southern California. Lester Thoreau made a distinction between consumption-oriented economic policies and investment-oriented policies. Fact is, we do get some, balance of trade benefit by producing defense products. We do sell them to other countries, but at the very basis, a strong orientation for spending in the area of defense is consumptive. Bombs basically sit on shelves and depreciate over time. We can build new and more weapons, but they don't really make our country wealthier. They don't make us stronger economically. Really, the battle for the next 40 years, the next 50 years is going to be who's going to get the country on top economically. If we begin to gradually reduce our defense and move in the direction of investment in, say, infrastructure, investment in new R&D, government-assisted R&D, as well as government incentives for people to invest privately, that's going to produce civilian-oriented industries, which will help us in the future vis-a-vis other competitors. And so, what is my basic thing? Is we need to move from a consumptive-oriented economy to investment-oriented, and that's going to take a little bit more explanation. Now, finally, I just want to make the argument that we've all alluded to spending more in education. Not all of us, but we've. I think Mr. Calvert agrees that we need to spend more in education. We need to, at least, if not spend more, we need to emphasize education more greatly. Let's not just talk about a brain trust. What are we going to do about a brain trust? We've got to talk about what are we going to do to keep that brain trust alive. What are we going to do to keep American PhDs, people in American PhD programs in the science and technology areas? We're talking about major attention to the educational arena. I've been on the front lines of education for the past 5 years, in the classroom, on the board of trustees of the community college. I have, I think, a very concrete experience of what the challenges are in education, what the motivational problems are among our students today, and now more than ever, the argument now more than ever, as we face restructuring here in Southern California, now's the time to put teachers in Congress, to include teachers in the policy making apparatus of this country. You know, the space program, whether we choose to emphasize, whether you're an advocate of full-bore spending on the space program or understand that we have to maybe develop our economy more to be able to provide the resources to support a space program in the future, it all gets back to the same question, the educational question, the education gap that we've got to fill. And that's, I think, an overwhelmingly powerful argument for my candidacy. And I'll touch on that more as we move on. I feel I've probably taken up more time than I should have. But thank you very much for having me here, and I'll look forward to your questions.
All right. Our last speaker for the morning will be Gene Berkman. He's a Libertarian candidate for the 43rd Congressional District. He's the owner of the Renaissance bookstore here in the Riverside area, and he writes on social issues. Mr. Berkman?
I'm Gene Berkman, Libertarian for Congress, 43rd District, and I'd like to thank Mr. Bliss and the Inland Empire Space Group for inviting me to come here. It indicates the kind of open-minded attitude that is necessary for a rational and pro-science society. And I thank you for being open-minded and for being rationally oriented, which is what is needed to deal with the scientific problems and problems of development of space. Now, I grew up in the 1950s and 1960s, and like many of you, I've been interested in space from a very early age. I grew up reading Ray Bradbury, Isaac Asimov, Paul Anderson, Robert Heinlein, the great classics of science fiction and popular science, many of whose books are available at Renaissance Bookshop. And like tens of millions, possibly hundreds of millions of Americans, I share a deep commitment to the dream of the human presence in space. But this dream has run into another astronomical object, which is the national debt of over $4 trillion. When I was growing up, the word trillion was only used in reference to space science fiction. Some of you may remember Carl Sagan on Cosmos and the many jokes Johnny Carson made at his expense. Billions of light years. Billions of miles. Well, billions and trillions now describe the national debt and the annual national deficit of the United States. And this deficit is not an abstract number like the distance to Jupiter. It's a very real number that is crushing our economy. Interest on the national debt this year is the #1 element of the federal budget. When I was growing up, national defense was the #1 element. And not everybody agreed it should be, but it was. Now national defense is #3. Social Security is #2, and interest on the national debt is #1, according to the recently published book, Bankruptcy in 1995. If present trends continue by 1994, the entire revenue of the federal government will be devoted to paying interest on the national debt. That is interest alone. That is no principal payment included. There is nothing being done to reduce this national debt, which is crushing our economy. Given financial straits like that, it is irresponsible for politicians to promise you a program of expanded space exploration because they know, as we know, that the government cannot deliver on their promises. The tax burden has already led to an unemployment rate of over 11% in the Inland Empire. Now, many of you may have jobs, and I hope you do. But in fact, there are over 11% of our fellow residents of the Inland Empire who are unemployed. And no space program is going to get enough contracts, no matter how much clout one of our congressmen might have on the space science team, to sop up that unemployment. The only solution for dealing with the economic depression we have now is real tax relief and real relief from the burden of the federal debt through drastic cuts in federal spending. Now, this does not mean we do not or cannot have a space program. Since we all agree tens of millions of Americans are interested in space exploration, there is a massive market for support of both profit-oriented and nonprofit foundations and profit-oriented companies to develop a space program based on free enterprise principles. I would refer you all to The Man Who Sold the Moon by Robert Heinlein, a visionary novel of the early 1940s in which some of the ideas for private financing of space exploration were developed. Not merely the development of new products in zero-G gravity, the development of research which can be licensed to manufacturers of medical products and other industrial technologies, but advertising. Every space launch is massively covered on worldwide TV. If you have, buy Coca-Cola on the side of the shuttle, lots of people will see it. Many people have wanted to look to the government to finance space exploration for the simple reason that they cannot conceive of the tens of billions of dollars needed to develop the technology and to implement the technology being available in the private sector. And yet, the private economy of the United States is over $5 trillion. There are numerous multi-billion-dollar corporations. Time Warner, when they merged, created a $10 billion conglomerate just in publishing and entertainment media. And that is not necessarily the biggest sector of the economy in this country. There are many others. Libertarians call for easing the tax burden through real tax relief, through abolishment of the federal income tax, and through the corresponding cuts in the federal budget needed to end the deficit and provide this tax relief, which will free up at least $500 billion a year, now going to the federal government in taxes, to the private sector, that would then be available for many new industries, including space-related industries and the technology needed to develop it, as well as the development of technology spin-offs from space exploration. We also call for an end to the often arbitrary use of antitrust laws which prevent cooperation between large-scale enterprises. Because cooperation between large-scale enterprises is necessarily going to be a part of space development. Now, if two $10 billion conglomerates wish to cooperate on a major project, they have to be cleared by the Securities Exchange Commission and numerous other regulatory agencies, which, as all government agencies are often motivated by factors other than the pure economic concern of serving the public. So we call for a free market approach to space development. And in answer to the specific questions, the answer should be fairly obvious from our viewpoint that this should not be a government program but a free market program. We call for those people concerned with developing a permanent human presence in space to make that concern felt through nonprofit foundations and through patronage of private for-profit companies and through investment in private for-profit companies, to make that their goal. It is not necessarily the goal of every American. And those Americans who do not share this goal should not be forced to part with their hard-earned money, if they are so lucky as to have a job, in order to support your goals and my goals in this case. We oppose the use of tax money for space exploration, and therefore we do support AVID, the commercialization of space. And we will look at any regulatory obstacles which prevent the commercialization of space. and in those regulatory obstacles which are a burden on the private enterprise economy. And we support the purchase by American companies and foundations of space technology from Russia, from the other former Soviet republics, and any other country. And we support a free trade position in international economy which would make possible enhanced cooperation among Americans, Europeans, Japanese, Koreans, other countries in Europe and Asia toward the type of cooperation necessary to fund and develop the technology necessary for private space exploration. I have the more complete answers available in type for anybody who might wish them, and I certainly would be glad to deal in the question and answer period. And if any of your questions are not answered by the end of this meeting, my door is open to you 6 days a week at 6639
Ms. Figaroa is going to have to leave to go to another event. And again, as we said previously, if you have any questions about George Brown, George Brown will be available next week in the Colton headquarters.
495 West Valley Boulevard on the corner of 4th and Valley in beautiful downtown Calvert. Got a bookstore there? Thank you.
All right, we're going to open up this forum to some questions from the floor. First off, though, I'd like to emphasize to everyone there's some material on the Inland Empire Space Group at the back desk. Also, a petition that the Inland Empire group has concerning supporting exploration of the solar system. If you're interested in space, you might want to take a look at that. At this point, we're going to allow you people to ask questions. I hope that you can make your questions fairly short on one issue and direct them perhaps at a specific candidate. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I'm unemployed aerospace engineer, and I don't want to address about the immediate problem of all this. We probably run 25% unemployed engineers in Southern California here. What's the plans, and I address it to you, of getting jobs down here for us, rather than send them to New Mexico there? That's number one. Number two, when are you Californian representatives and senators going to get together and act as a team rather than 56 different individuals there? So we have something that will help the state. Yeah, I'm interested in you.
Well, let me answer on behalf of Mr. Calvert, and I can do so with some authority because this is something that's very near and dear to his heart, something that we've discussed many times. Unlike Mr. Tekano, Mr. Calvert is not a recent convert to supporting what is part of the fabric, the social fabric of Southern California, and that is space, science, and technology. I'm pleased personally to be here today, sir, because up till now, Mr. Tekano has been, you should feel very comfortable here, a stealth candidate on these issues. And this is the first time that I've actually heard him explain some of his positions. What we have to do is to not make these sort of, and I don't want to pick on Mr. Tekano, there are those running for public office, if I can couch it in those terms, sir, who subscribe to what I would call the Walt Disney theory of economic development. And that is, if we all hold hands and wish it so, it's going to happen. And the cold hard facts of the matter is California is not going to transition to some utopia where we're all sitting around fixing electric cars and we're doing all these things without some intermediary steps. And that means, number one, we've got to keep the people employed, such as yourself, who are employed. We keep them employed as we transition from a defensive posture into an investment in infrastructure posture, which I will agree with Mr. Tekano and others. We have to get there. But to say that we can just hold hands and wish it so, it's not going to happen. Second of all, power abhors a vacuum. Engineers understand vacuums. As we announce scale downs in our defense, let me share with you that China just announced a 13% increase in their national defense expenditure. So to say that there isn't any national threat is an illusion. It's actually nonsensical psychobabble, and it's something that comes from the left all the time. There is a breakup of the Soviet Union, and we clearly understand that. But the threats that we're facing now is the re-Balkanization of Europe and the problems that fractionalize the Middle East. The problem is not the Soviet Union. The problems that face us are Mr. Rafsanjani and his current power struggle in Iraq with Mr. Khomeini. And Mr. Rafsanjani is stacking in his arsenal MiG-29s that he's bought and And MiG-29 said he confiscated from Iran during the war. There's also a submarine on the way there. To say that there isn't a national threat is ridiculous. So we can accomplish three major goals. We can continue to defend the United States adequately. We can preserve its position as the #1 power throughout the world. And we can keep our people employed and have them continuing to learn and create that mental strength that we need if we're going to transition while we transition from here to there. The other part, sir, if I can just capitalize on that, is that Mr. Tekano puts himself forth as an education candidate. And if you listen to what he has said or what he's implied in the past, is that he thinks the status quo is just wonderful. That graduating illiterates is just a marvelous situation, and that we're just doing a fantastic job. That, again, sir, is nonsensical psychobabble. The status quo, and Mr. Tekano, I think if he stood up, would admit to you that it's not because education in this country is such a wonderful vehicle to get bright minds to do what we need to do, but because he sees it as a major part of the social fabric of the United States. Well, sir, I'd assure you that the major part is the people who are working. Mr. Calvert supports choice. That means if your child wants to go to a school that is better equipped to teach them science and technology, Mr. Calvert advocates your right as a parent to do so, and Mr. Tekano and his associates would advocate that you don't have that right. Long answer to a short question. Mr. Calvert advocates choice to educate the people, a vehicle through which to educate them, keep them educated as we transition, and forget this nonsense that there's no threat to the United States because it's an illusion. I hope I answered your question.
No, you didn't answer my question, but a lot of fine rhetoric there.
Okay, how about if we get Mr. Tekano to respond?
Great, thank you. First of all, I never said that I don't think there are some formidable threats out there. Yes, there are some threats, but I think it's very, very clear that no matter who becomes the next president, we're going to continue to see a scale down in spending in both these areas. And I defy Mr. Wolf to prove to me otherwise. We here in California are going to continue to see cutbacks in spending in defense, no matter who is elected the next president, and that's the bottom line. The fact is that, I assert that that the threat that we previously felt, that the Cold War that we fought, the sacrifices that we made in the past few years, that there is a general sense, and I think it's just as ludicrous and fantasyland to believe that context still exists for us in this world. Yes, we have to keep our guard up. Yes, we have to continue to produce weapons. But we need to really think about facing a new challenge. Let me give you a specific idea. I don't believe for any minute that we can go to a Disneyland situation and have electric cars appear overnight. But the people who have been put out of work, the high-paying people who buy things at the North, and believe me, the minute we're competing to have Kmart locate in our community to provide some jobs. That's a very surface level job, a service sector job, and I don't want to put down people who work down at Kmart. But the people who buy things at Kmart and Nordstrom were the people who were employed in high-paying engineering jobs, decently paying jobs in the machinist sector, people who were in the aerospace industry. What are we going to do to replace that? Well, I think what we can do in California is use the motivation to clean up our air as one specific thing, one area that can provide a broad base of jobs here in Southern California. What am I talking about? I think we should move towards converting our automobile fleets here in Southern California to run on natural gas and combustible basis as an intermediary step. Okay, we should move in the direction of alternative renewable fuels, and there's a long-term strategy that has a lot of steps in the middle, which can employ a lot of many of the engineers and scientists who were employed in the aerospace area. We need to improve the business climate here to prevent companies moving from California to Arizona and other parts of the country. That's a whole thing that I think we need revision in state policy to deal with that. But nevertheless, I think the cutback in job is not just that we're losing present contracts and present manufacturing opportunities to other states because of more favorable business. We're just scaling back in the big picture too. That's the big picture that we're scaling back into. Question is, I want to ask my libertarian friends and all of you here, do you believe that the private marketplace is going to recover and adjust on its own to these cutbacks in defense and aerospace here? Is that what you and I believe? Or is there going to have to be some government change in policy, some conversion policy? I believe the government has a role in the conversion policy, and that through government, series of government intervention mandates and private sector incentives, we can begin to move toward building new industries. Now, let me just give you some enumerated steps. Initially, the government can require all of its fleets, all of its own fleets, to begin to work on natural gas. Okay? That's one, and natural gas may not be the only solution, maybe other solutions too. But that's going to start creating an infrastructure for a distribution system in this country. And natural gas, by the way, is an alternative fuel which is plentiful in this country alone. Okay? I had the opportunity to spend a few minutes with a person who owns a great deal of natural gas in this country. And frankly, this is one of the reasons why we have problems in the Middle East is because of a lack of resources. And this country needs to put itself on a serious path for energy independence. What that distribution system the government initial mandates on its private fleets is just the beginning. We can begin through tax incentives encourage private citizens like you and me to begin to convert existing automobiles through simple modifications on our already combustion engines to burn natural gas, to install other kinds of gas tanks. There are some problems currently with the storage facilities, the storage technology, but who best to put to work on solving that problem but some of our engineers who are building weapons before. People who are already out of work. There are 20, you already mentioned that you're out of work, right? You said you're out of work.
Oh, yeah.
So you're already out of work. There are people we can put to work on this right now through direct government R&D and through incentives for people to do research and development. What's the long-term stuff? I mentioned fuel cells. Fuel cells are being installed right now at Kaiser Hospital, okay? Not right now, but next year. There's one in the Hyatt hotels just recently over in some other part of Southern California. The Southern California Gas Company wants to install 12 of these things. This came out of the space program. United Technologies, United is a U.S.-based defense firm which produces predominantly defense products, but it has a subsidiary, International Fuels Corporation, which employs 200 people. The policies of this government ought to be so that by the end of this decade, that division of United Technologies ought to be its largest, and ought to be maybe located here in Southern California. And these fuel cells can produce electricity at 1/20th emission rate. 1/20th emission rate of all other kinds of energy technologies. That's very important for Southern California because we can only go so far in getting stationary sources of pollution to reduce their fuel emission. And that's one of the reasons why business is leaving, is because of our environmental regulations on the air. I favor loosening up, not loosening up, but making more flexible the kinds of requirements we're putting on businesses so they don't have that motivation to leave. Market-based kinds of incentives rather than command and control standards that we impose on businesses. But we're really going to have to go after the mobile sources of pollution if we're going to really attack this serious problem in California. And that means developing a long-range program to develop an infrastructure for electric cars. 10 to 15 years from now, these fuel cells can be reduced in size, I believe, perhaps, to fit under the hood of a car. And if we've developed through a conversion process of converting our fleets to natural gas to burn on a combustion engine basis, we already have an infrastructure, both private and public, to deliver natural gas to everyone. This natural gas can be put through a fuel cell, power the electricity for the car, at an incredibly clean rate, 83% efficiency. As you know, it's CH4, really what uses hydrogen. 25 to 50 years from now, we can be completely energy independent by virtue of the fact that we may have protected by that point, also through government investment and also private incentives from the private marketplace to develop hydrogen, solar-assisted hydrogen production, which can in turn okay, I know it sounds
Okay, Mr. Berkman would like to respond.
Yeah, I'd like to mention something which nobody's mentioned, and I'm not blaming my opponents. I had intended to mention it when I was at the podium and forgot. One problem of the high unemployment currently in Southern California, besides the general problem of the nationwide recession, is that since the 50s, the California economy has been excessively dependent on government contracts in the defense and aerospace industry. And we're going through a transition now when the money available, even as tax revenues are at an all-time high, the money available because of servicing the debt and because of entitlement programs is declining. then there is inevitably going to be an adjustment. I don't say I have the answer. The answer ultimately, over the long term, is in fact a change in government policy, getting the government out of the way of the economy so that the private enterprise system can continue its development as it got us to the point now where we're the richest country in the world. Not thanks to government contracts, not thanks to government technology, not even thanks to government tax credits for private sector development, but thanks to the private capitalist system. That's the long-term solution. I don't have a short-term solution. I personally don't know any private companies that can hire you, but I challenge my opponents. I challenge my opponents who are making promises on behalf of the government to assure you that their promises will be able to be carried out by the new government that comes in that's going to be faced with this $400 trillion deficit and continuously $4 trillion national debt and $400 billion national deficit on an annual basis.
I'd like to say that in 15 minutes you have one question from the audience. One question.
Yeah, okay, we'll finish this up, and then we'll encourage the candidates to answer. Okay, we'll encourage the candidates to speed up.
Right.
All right, we have another question from the floor. The fellow in the back with the beard.
Thank you. I'd like to go to the representative Calvert, or the representative of Mr. Calvert.
Soon to be representative.
You alluded at the very start to a range clause, and that being that the United States is the present most competitive power. And yet you also alluded to strengthening the defense budget. Typically, defense industry programs have had security clearances and have interfered with that information getting into the sellable form. I'd like to give you a very explicit situation that I'm in right now. I work for a medical equipment company. We're developing a new piece of equipment. This has an embedded XT processor using one of the newest chips. Okay, we were just recently been informed that this chip cannot be sold to any of the items, and it just so happens that our very first orders came in from China. Okay, the present aerospace industry has produced constraints on our ability to produce non-aerospace items that are almost beyond belief. It hampers every form of our ability to compete. And it's costing my company money. We've got a hiring freeze. We need people, but we can't hire them because we can't sell product. What are we going to do about this?
And I'll be as brief as I can, sir, and the sensitivity to everybody. That is something that Mr. Calvert, again, is very sensitive to. If you listen to Mr. Tekano, and I'm leaving our libertarian friends alone because, frankly, they have some good ideas, although we don't agree on a lot of things. But Mr. Tekano, first of all, one of the reasons that companies are leaving California are some of the same nonsensical regulations that are keeping us from transitioning. And if Mr. Tekano were to be elected, the way Congress works, Mr. Tekano would go back and he owes allegiance to Mr. Fazio, who got him elected. And if Mr. Tekano wants to sit on any committee and not languish in some back bathroom somewhere in the Cannon building, furthest from the Capitol, then he's going to espouse these same environmental types of constraints that are driving California companies out of California by droves. He's just going to have to do it. To say that he won't, he is either very naive or he's being less than truthful with you. That kind of regulation is what that side of the aisle tries to do. Mr. Calvert sees in national defense a multitude of technological advances that can be translated to the private sector and will work very hard to the extent that it does not compromise national defense, to translate those defense-related
These
quantities.
regulations are from the defense industry. They're not from the environmental.
No, I understand. I'm making a point as far as constraints. And Mr. Calvert will work very hard to eliminate any constraints other than national defense, of course. I mean, to translate technological advances made within the confines of DoD into the private sector and get there as quickly as possible. So some of the laudable goals that Mr. Tekano are talking about can be achieved. They're not going to be achieved from the bottom up. It's impossible. If I can take the moment just to answer one other question. There is a California Institute, back to sort of answering both. And that is ostensibly a consortium of now 45, and after the election, 52 congressmen from California who are trying to work together for common good, for the common goals. And I want to tell you that the Republicans involved in that effort, Mr. Lewis, who's very strong in there, Mr. McCandless, who's now representing the 43rd, and will go to the 44th, are very anxious to do just what we're talking about, advance California because there's a concept that's in Washington, it's ABC, anywhere but California. And it's because we can't get together. We have 12%, we'll have 12% of the elected officials in Congress, and yet no two of them can agree what the third one should be voting on. We've got to get past that. In order to do that, we have got to get past the grasp on the power, the committee power that's in Congress right now. And that grasp of power is in the hands of people that are supporting Mr. Tekano, the big Fazios of the world, the democratic power structure that will lead you to believe that for you, strength. What we need is a good leave alone, and we'll get on with it.
Okay, questions?
Just a quick question. What was Mr. Calvert?
I'm sorry, Mr. Calvert had a previous engagement. He could not change it. It was cast in concrete prior to this invitation being received. And he asked me to come in his stead. And I'm sorry that he's not here. I'm sure that he would answer in the same day.
Ben?
Do you want to respond? I do want to respond.
No, I have a question.
Sure. I just want to respond very quick. I'm sorry it took so long, but I felt impelled to be able to show you that there's a rational long-term plan which can directly impact your employability. Okay? Directly impact your employability. I have every intention of cooperating and getting this delegation to cooperate. You know, the partisan infighting can't be blamed on one party or the Democratic Party structure. The fact is, this district is going to benefit perhaps even more greatly to have somebody who is within the majority party structure. And the fact is, I believe and I assert that it will be a Democratic Congress next year that will be elected. And, but nonetheless, I feel very, very strongly that this district will produce moderate, neither so left-leaning or right-leaning people who will forge the consensus, who will be the people who forge the consensus in this delegation. So, you know, just on that count alone, you know, I believe that, that charge that I'm going to represent some party structure that's not going to move this country forward is, I think, is absolutely false.
Hey, Ben, question?
We've been discussing the economy, and let's look at the facts. In the 1960s, during the height of the Apollo program, we were spending 1% of the federal budget on space. Today, we're spending about 1% of the federal budget on space, and in terms of GNP, it's about a third of what we were spending back in the height of Apollo. And most studies have indicated you get back between a 4-to-1 to a 10-to-1 return on your investment, depending on whose figures you believe. And if you give NASA, I'm not talking defense, I'm talking strictly civilian space, you give NASA's budget to Social Security, they spend it in 2.5 weeks. So will you please tell me why me, as an educated, highly experienced engineer who wants to create new wealth for this country by utilizing non-terrestrial resources, by developing technology, why you gentlemen are telling me that, I'm sorry, we can't do that because we have to redistribute the wealth. And even though you're only a little piece of what's going on, you don't count.
Yeah,
We're not all saying that.
All the candidates.
Let's start with
Okay.
Tekano.
First of all, I also want to respond to that gentleman's question back there. That it's a perfect example of how defense-oriented research, R&D, can result in a restriction on it. Now, I believe in spending defense, but that's the argument for orienting our policies towards civilian R&D, and that civilian R&D is space program. Now, where are we going to get the money? I mean, we have a limited budget. We were constrained by a budget deficit and a great national federal debt. Now, my belief, and I think I echo the sentiments of Mr. Calvert's representative, that we can't get rid of this debt overnight. We didn't get it overnight. It's going to have to be a gradual reduction. Part of that reduction is going to involve policies which promote economic growth. And where have I emphasized my comments tonight on economic growth here in Southern California, specifically to employ people here? You may not agree that this is the industry. I don't know if this is going to be the industry which results in the future, but this is one specific example of where we can begin to invest in alternative civilian technologies that are not necessarily defense-oriented, which will position us to be able to sell products, advanced technology in the open market, which aren't defense-related. There's no reason why we can't continue to spend in certain areas with the expectation that it's going to produce more employment, more productivity. That's my argument, that we need to produce products that are going to be more widely used and more widely marketable in the world, in the global markets. And those are the investment policy. That's an investment policy, not a consumption policy. Okay, not stuff we're going to build and maybe expend and bomb or let on the shelf in the expectation that someone's going to hurt us. And we have to do some of that. But really where our policy has to be is developing the offshoots of the space technology and offshoots of the defense R&D, government-assisted R&D, to commercialize these products and to employ people like you who are highly educated in these areas. And can we afford, we can't afford not to spend in this area because it's developing for our future. It's an investment in our future. Yes, we've maxed out our credit cards and then some, but we don't spend the whole next paycheck to pay off the debt. We're going to have to continue buying groceries, and if I can use this analogy, we're going to have to continue paying for our children's education. We're going to have to continue to invest in ourselves so that we don't fall behind these other countries who are better positioned than us to grab a hold of what is going to be in the future global marketplace.
Mr. Warden?
I'd like to begin by suggesting that the problem is not whether we're going to use our whole next paycheck to pay off the debt. The problem is whether we're going to be able to make the next payment on the interest. That's the problem. The problem is not the debt at this point anymore. Let me suggest that it seems to me you're asking two things. You're asking, first of all, why should we libertarians or candidates in general not choose to invest in NASA when we can promise between 4 to 10 to 1 return on the investment? And second, you're asking why should we continue to choose to just simply reallocate resources and transfer payments? As a libertarian,
The percentages involved.
yeah, as a libertarian, I oppose the reallocation of resources as transfer payments. I would outright argue that we'd be much better off if private charities were in fact done privately rather than publicly. In answer to your other question about a 10 to 1 response or even 4 to 1 return on investment, I'll be very frank with you, I don't believe you. But even if that were true, even if it were true, I guarantee you on a private market, if you could promise someone a 2 to 1 return, half of what you gave is the lowest bidder, you would have investors flocking to you. Investments today return only about 5% per annum on capital. If you can return twice the investment instantly, you will have no problem finding people to invest in the space industry and employ you. And that's without any government spending at all. Moreover, it would be even easier on the market if the libertarians are in charge. Why? Primarily because the regulations and the taxation, which drastically is hurting our industries today, would have absolutely no bearing in a libertarian world. For example, Kodak Eastman recently submitted an environmental report. It was 7.5 feet tall. That's higher than I can stand and reach. That's pretty impressive. That's a lot of money and a lot of resources that in the libertarian world investors are not going to have to be making. So I would assert that if you can even return half of the lowest figure of what you promised, you'll have no problem getting investments.
Ms. Berkman?
First,
Excuse
excuse me, we have a question on the floor.
Yeah, I have a question. First of all,
Excuse me, we'll get to you in a moment.
when?
Absolutely next. First, I'd like to say that Eastman Kodak had to submit an environmental report that was 7.5 feet tall. You should all remember the trees died for that environment.
Several of them.
Any of us concerned with the environment should certainly make a priority of cutting back government paperwork. But in fact, what Fritz said is very true. If you can show a 4 to 1 or 10 to 1 return on investment, I can find people for you right now to invest in. That's an unbelievably good rate of investment. It's hard to believe any government program has done it, since every government program I've ever seen has run into deficit. Now, as to the very real question of the decline of NASA budgeting as a relative portion of the gross national product, or the lack of increase of NASA funding as a portion of the government budget, I will make 2 points. This, if you see it as a problem, you should see it as a problem of relying upon the government as the prime funder of space exploration. If private enterprise, unfettered and untaxed, were the prime funder of space exploration, then it would respond to market demand. And if the market demand and the market returns are as you say they are, there would have been a massive increase, a move of capital from other industries to space-oriented industries to take advantage of this 4 to 1 or 10 to 1 return. In fact, people who are now investing and getting 5-6% return on their investments, or even 10 or 20% return on their investments, would sell out, liquidate even at a loss, to invest in any project that would guarantee 4 to 1 or 10 to 1 returns. No doubt about it. The other thing is this, that by relying on government as the prime funder for social projects, other than those which we libertarians believe in, which is protection of life, liberty, and property, and an adequate national defense, to rely on government to engage in social engineering, investment projects, development of new technology, or anything like this, you have to face the fact that you're up against other people with different interests. And you lead to a civil war of interest groups fighting over a limited and, in fact, now, due to the debt, declining national budget. And if you think this is not a real problem, then I invite you to listen to the answers of my Democratic and Republican opponents who are promising you a certain amount of funding for space projects. And then on October 22nd, come to Corona for the campaign forum of the American Association of Retired Persons, where they will be asked whether they will guarantee Social Security funding, even if it means cutting back space programs and other projects, and compare their answers today with their answers on October 22nd. And you can compare my answers, and you will find my answers are the same.
Okay. Yes, Warden?
I won't comment on that, but I think you'll find that Mr. Calvert's answers are reasonable in both regards. You know, just quickly talking about paperwork, I'm reminded that when I asked the Congress, Democratic member of Congress, for information on the Paperwork Reduction Act, he gave me 3 copies of the Paperwork Reduction Act. So I was very pleased to get that, and I assured him that I would put them to good use as I threw 2 away, one on my shelf. Mr. Tekano responded initially to the question here in a rather naive way, I believe, and he said that the reason he wants to support NASA instead of DOD is because we can forestall the problems that the other gentleman in the back of the beer talked about not being able to transfer secrets. And Mr. Tekano then assumes, whether naively or just overlooked it, that if something is developed within NASA that is of a strategic defense nature or could be qualified secret, that you could just transfer just because it happened to be thought up under a NASA endowment, and that's totally false, and I don't think he really meant that. If he'd have thought it through, he'd have never responded like that. The fact of the matter is that America is a country hell-bent on beating swords into plowshares. The problem is that an inordinate amount of those swords are marked made in California. Okay. The problem is that we need someone who will fight for you as people here in California, that will get government onto that, people who are here, so that you can go about the business and that we don't lose the infrastructure and the brain trust that we have now to other states competing against us, beating us up on the very kind of constraints that the Democratic Party would love to have you work under. What we need is a good leave alone. You know, I'll quote a Democrat if I may, and that's John Kennedy. When he was talking about cutting taxes, he alluded to the fact that a rising tide raises all ships, and I agree. But none of your ships at the bottom of the ocean with its guts ripped out on the rocks and shoals of economic restraint and governmental regulation, because then all a rising tide does is put more distance between you and the surface. And what we have here in California are those who would like to rip the guts out of our ship and put us as second-class citizens and not let us compete with the rest of the nation, let alone the world, in those areas that do return 4 and 10 times on the investment. By constraining us, by doing what Big Brother types of things will do, it simply won't work. What we're advocating is Republican
Please
Party.
answer the current question, not the one before.
I'm trying to respond to the questions.
No, you're answering his question, not his.
Well, if I may.
Thank you.
Okay. To answer that again, Mr. Calvert has never advocated, and I think I said in the comments up front, cutting. He is actually interested in investing in those aspects of space science and technology that return on the investment. Does that answer it, sir? Thank you.
Okay, short question.
Just about time. All the candidates up here, it's whitewash bullshit. You had this town meeting for the public, and now you want to have 3 questions. You're the moderator.
Do you have a question?
I'm going to ask you a question, but you can't have patience for me, but you can have patience for the candidates. Get your issue right, straight. We are the governors, not you guys. You understand that? I hope you understand that, and take that back to Congress or wherever you represent. Now, my question for all the candidates, libertarians. I want to know how many of you guys have balanced your own personal budgets.
That's not an appropriate question for you.
But it's relative to the government. If you think that you can balance the federal government budget when 235 million people in America cannot balance their own budget, then you're living in fantasy. When Tekano talk about,
sir, this is
I'm posing a question to these people.
the subject of the forum is on aerospace issues,
I know, but it hasn't been on for the last hour and a half since I've been here.
and not asking the questions on aerospace issues will only continue that. If you don't have a question on aerospace issues,
I'm going to ask
we'll go
my
to someone
question
else.
whether you like it or not, or we'll have a disruptive conference. You understand that? Now, my
If you're
question-
planning to disrupt the conference, we'll have to ask you to leave.
Well, I'm not leaving. This is America. Remember, you're talking about that.
Again,
Understand
this
that.
is
My question to
for-
Mr. Tekano, if he's been in forefront of education, and my question to Mr. Calvert, representative, who Mr. Calvert cannot be here today because we're not important, and to the libertarian candidates, get your issues straight. America's economic problems come from you guys because you do not realize.
Okay, if you don't have a question, we'll have to go to someone else. Does anyone else have a question?
I have a question. Can you
If
understand
If
it?
there are any more, no more
Can
questions,
you
at
understand
this
it?
point, we'll have to close the forum.
Then you close it.
No, slow down, I don't have a question.
Okay, thank you.
Then we'll close it.
We have a question on the floor.
I have a question, and you haven't heard my question yet.
We've heard a statement from.
No, I have a question to ask. I have been in the military for 20 years, and for 20 years I've served my country, and you're gonna refuse me a question
You haven't answered an aerospace question.
because you keep yakking.
No,
Okay, we're gonna have to ask someone else to ask the question. Do you have a question on
Do
the
you have a question?
If there are no questions, then we'll have to.
We have questions.
He's not directing his question to me.
You don't have a question on aerospace, we'll have to ask you to pass. Ben.
More germane to the form that we have here, I'm going to quote from NASA's Authorization Act of 1988. The Congress declared that the extension of human life beyond Earth's atmosphere, leading ultimately to the establishment of space settlements, will fulfill the purposes of advancing science, exploration, and development, and will enhance the general welfare. Do you gentlemen believe in that statement?
Can
Yes
we have
or no?
short
Yes or
responses
no?
to that?
That's
Very
the
short
question.
responses. We'll start with Mr. Wolf.
On behalf of Mr. Calvert, very much so, and I'm sorry, I referred to his notes, but what I exact from and given one word, yes, very much so.
Mr. Berkman.
I think Congress has clearly shown that it is incapable of understanding what can enhance the general welfare of the United States. I believe many of us are individually committed to permanent human presence in space, and if we do it on a private enterprise basis, it can enhance the general welfare. Doing it through government will end up with just another fiasco, such as the savings and loan mess and every other mess the government has gotten us into.
My question was, do you agree with that statement, yes or no?
My answer is that I don't believe Congress can judge what is in the general
The
welfare.
Congress didn't say that they're doing it, they
They
declared.
passed that. I'm saying I question Congress's authority or ability
The
to
answer
deal with
is
the subject of human welfare.
The words that Congress declares. The statement then that the extension of life, et cetera, will enhance the general welfare. Do you believe that the answer to that question is yes or no?
I think that is a question that will be answered in the marketplace. That it may enhance human welfare or it may be detrimental to human welfare depending on whether private agencies or government agencies are in charge.
Okay, Mr. Ward.
I think government is detrimental to human welfare.
Mr. Ward.
I don't buy a Aristotelian yes, no, A, B games, but I'll answer more specific ways you did. If it is beneficial, then it will be funded on the marketplace. If it is not, then it won't be. I tend to suspect that it is beneficial and will be funded, although I suspect your 10 to 1 or 4 to 1 figures are exaggerated.
I wasn't asking like a refund.
All right, Mr. Tekano.
I just,
I'll say one. Emphatically, yes, and it's a matter of what the time frame is. And secondly, and I'll be very brief, I believe that marketplaces won't necessarily handle things on their own, that there's a role for governments and marketplaces to work together. There's an appropriate balance. And And I don't think Mr. Calvert would disagree with that. In fact, I think he'd very much agree with me wholeheartedly on that fact. And I've been trying to, there's an obvious technique upon his representative painting in certain corners and painting as a straw man, which I very much resent, but I just want to make sure that the people understood what was going on.
Okay, let's go one more question from the gentleman back there.
One remark and two short questions. First remark, you talked about return on investment on an annual basis of 5%. So yes, this is right. But I believe gentlemen here were thinking about return on investment in long terms, like 10 and 20 years, and of course you can get 4 to 10 times return on investment. I guess this was
I wasn't sure what he did.
Fine. First question, as you might well know, our general aviation industry is suffering heavily, and it's almost dead due to our own regulations and rules and laws we created here in this country. What are you doing about changing this trend? Maybe somebody could comment on that. And second question is, commercial aviation around the world is quite prospering, but we are losing more and more market shares in this area, and I'm sure we could regain a lot of this business again. This would put all those beautiful aeronautical engineers again into business. So what are we trying to do about that?
Okay, let's have 1 minute answers from here to here on those two questions.
Okay, it is in our interest to streamline and make the regulations light enough so that we can encourage businesses to continue to exist here in California. Okay, at the same time, we cannot move backward on our commitment to clean up our environment. And I hate this one, but commercial aviation, perfect example. I know I talk. Commercial aviation is a perfect example of where we've got to reconsider this complete divorced market idea from the government. Airbus is the example of it. The Europeans are competing with Boeing here in this country. Okay, we can't have strict ideological viewpoints. GATT hasn't determined what government subsidies are. No international treaty really has done that sufficiently. And if other governments are going to play hardball with us, we've got to consider certain forms of cooperation that mean hardball back in order to assist key industries in this country. A winner-driven, and Mr. Thoreau talks about winner-driven trade policies. And I believe there's some I can't explain it all in 1 minute. I've gone over my minute, but basically that's it. I agree with you. We have a serious problem with commercial, not only just commercial aviation, but a lot of areas that this government has to rethink in terms of its strategic positioning in the global marketplace.
And you will try to change that.
I will fight to lead us out of ideological shibboleths, which prevent us from doing what's pragmatic and what works. The rest of the world doesn't play by the rules that we seem to think the world plays by. We're going to have to go beyond that. Thank you very much.
Mr. Warden?
In response to your first question, which is about deregulation, or at least streamlining regulations, I think every member of the Libertarian Party would favor that. California is losing for 7,000 jobs a month due to regulation. I think it's high time we cut that out. I would also point out this is a candidate's forum for congressional candidates, and alas, many of us only have powers on federal regulations, and we really need to clean up the state. And you may want to speak to Jane Hinson, who's candidate for assembly right there about that. Quite apart from that, your other question, I am still going to stick to my basic argument. I think that markets will determine what areas are most profitable to invest in. If you go ahead and make governments invest in other areas, you're reallocating resources to less efficient areas of investment, and that, I think, makes the country poorer.
You will lose to countries abroad anyhow then, you know.
I'm sorry?
You will lose then your competition anyhow if, let's say, other countries will
Okay,
support them.
let's let the candidates
I
answer.
only have a minute to respond, so I'm using it.
Libertarians call for deregulation of the economy at both the federal and state levels. We think the only valid regulations are to prevent forced and fraud, or attacks on life, liberty, and property. And within this context, of course, pollution is an attack on people's lives, but all regulation concerning that or other types of force or fraud should be results-oriented rather than creating abstract processes enforced by government bureaucrats. As far as America competing in Airbus or any other area, we do not support any kind of government direction of the economy, whether they're planning joint ventures, tax credits, or tax deductions even directed at certain types of research, because we feel that this is not merely impractical, it is immoral. The marketplace is the determinant, the means by which the consumers show their preferences. And to use the government to forcibly redistribute assets to put into projects favored by government bureaucrats is immoral. And as far as practical effects, we focus on one or another European industry or Japanese industry which seems to be so successful because the government took a guiding hand, and yet there are many other European industries that may be less successful because they had to bear the burden of taxation. And we don't see those because they're in bankruptcy, and European bankruptcy courts are not commonly covered on American television. Although I did once see Head of Rizzoli Publishing taken away by the bankruptcy police in the Spiegel magazine. So there is a certain minor news value to unsuccessful attempts by government to direct the economy when the big media show is focused on those joint government-private projects which seem to have succeeded. In fact, the economy is a big thing, and the consumers of the entire world are a big market. The other aspect of this is, if the Europeans can develop a better Airbus that serves American consumers better, we advocate free trade so American consumers can take advantage.
Okay, Mr. Wolf.
Thank you. Try to respond specifically to your question, sir. Mr. Calvert truly believes that the problem with general aviation in this country is nothing more than product liability laws and the trial attorneys that continue to press. That's simply because somebody ran out of fuel and screwed his airplane into the hill. Somehow, by some osmosis process, the manufacturer is responsible. Mr. Calvert is on record time and time again in his dedication to work as hard as possible against those very types of individuals who actually feed on they have drained the blood out of the body of American business, and they're now breaking the bones and sucking out the marrow. And that is the trial lawyers of this country. Mr. Calvert is going to work as hard as he can to try to put that an end. As far as commercial aviation and some of these international things, I'll agree with Mr. Tekano, nobody fall over please, that there is a place where government has to act. And I think where we differ is to what degree does government interact. What America needs from government is a good leave alone and let government act as a catalyst for private business development. Mr. Tekano, I believe, and I'm not going to speak for him, believes a greater depth of government intervention. But sir, I just want to leave you with one thing in those particular things. Mr. Calvert has hanging in his office something that he asked me to share, and I thought I would share with you, and it's a quote. And it says, throughout the ages, those nations which have pushed outward to explore new frontiers, which have had a momentum built from optimism and the sense of a promising future, have reaped dividends of commerce, science, engineering, and knowledge as a result of their efforts. And that quote's a quote from Alan Shepard, and it's something Mr. Calvert truly believes in very deeply, and he's committed to the space program of this country and its national defense.
All right. With that, we're going to have to wrap this up. So we'll see everybody. We'll do this again in 2 years, and we'll see you all again then.
Thank you very much.
And feel free to speak to the candidates before they leave.
Next Congressional.